Good morning, friends. You're most welcome to Think Ice channel. Today we are going to discuss Practicing Anthropology by MAAN IGNOU, and our topic is disaster management. Let us begin the topic. Anthropological understanding of disasters. For understanding disaster, it is important to differentiate between hazards and disaster. Although they are very closely related and sometimes used interchangeably, hazard is a life-threatening event and disaster is a consequence of this event. When hazard acts upon a population, it may result into disaster. Not all hazards will lead to disaster, but when hazards interact with a vulnerable population, it will lead to disaster. The idea of vulnerability is very important to understand disaster. The following equation will make things clearer. Vulnerability into hazard is equal to disaster. Now, one may ask that what do we mean by vulnerability? Wisner et al. 2004 answers this question by defining vulnerability as the characteristic of a person or group and their situation that influence their capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist and recover from the impact of a disaster. This definition makes it clear that vulnerability is the characteristic of the population which makes them more susceptible for damage due to hazards. Population is a heterogeneous entity, that is, there are different kinds of people, there are different groups in a population that differ from each other on important parameters like age, gender, caste, religion, ethnic identity, class, etc. These different groups are differentially susceptible to hazards. It is a common observation that people from lower socioeconomic strata are more affected than people from upper strata. Again, elderly female or children are more affected during hazard impact. The vulnerability approach to disaster discussed above is something in which anthropologists are interested, and their conception of disaster revolves largely around this issue. Anthropology, since its inception, has been interested into deciphering or knowing about different populations of the world, their society and culture. This twin concept of society and culture has caught the imagination of anthropologists since its beginning. They are more interested in knowing about the socio structure of community. They are more interested in knowing about the social structure of a community, that is to say, about their social relationships and laws governing those relationships. Also, they paid attention to the underlying cultural basis of the relationship. Also, they paid attention to underlying cultural basis of these relationships. It is this social structure that makes population vulnerable to hazards. They have also advocated about understanding a society from amic perspective, people's point of view, and being holistic in understanding any society. Hence, when anthropologists try to understand disaster, they bring in all these concepts. For an anthropologist, disasters are situated more in the community than in the event itself. Thus, disaster is seen more as a process than an event. She tries to understand that how a disaster event will impact the entire community under study and how different institutions in a society will get affected by a disaster. The fundamental framework of holistic investigation in anthropology is most suited for disaster studies since disasters are all encompassing and only a complete view is suited to understand them fully. Looking from an amic perspective, an anthropologist will try to understand the term disaster as defined by the people themselves and how their conception is different from that of the relief providers and relief agencies. Anthropologists will also understand the community response to the extreme events, how well the community is equipped to handle disaster situation, and how the local support system in the form of various institutions like family, kinship, etc., helps in disaster response. In these terms, anthropologists are more interested to understand the social capital of the community, social resources in the terms of relationship that are helpful to cope with extreme events. Anthropologists are interested in understanding change in a society, and a disaster situation will give opportunity to look into these dimensions. An anthropologist will look into how the society and its social institutions undergo change after disaster. It has been documented that areas which are flooded every year show a change in the marriage pattern. Families are no longer interested in marrying their daughters to people residing in those areas since they may have to face hardship due to annual flooding. This has changed the marriage pattern in these areas since availability of bride is reduced immensely, which in turn has promoted the practice of buying wives from other far-flung areas. Likewise, there can be changes related to other dimensions in the society like relationship between people, change in the political power structure due to changing affiliation in the wake of disaster. The above discussion largely pertains to the branch of socio-cultural anthropology, but anthropologists also try to understand disaster impacts from physical anthropological dimensions. A physical anthropologist is more interested in knowing how biological features interact with the socio-cultural features. Vulnerability is not only social in nature but it can also be physical or biological. For example, consider the population where some of the people are malnourished. Will they not be more vulnerable in a disaster situation, which results in economic depletion and in turn lead to less nourishment? These people will also be more susceptible to various disease outbreak after disaster, although malnourishment is again due to poor economic condition which can be socially constructed in the form of marginal groups, but measuring the level and extent of malnourishment would require the skills of a physical anthropologist who, with the help of his or her anthropometric rod, calipers, and other instruments, will decide about the status of malnourishment. This will again help us to understand disaster in a holistic perspective. Joshi et al. 2010. There is yet another branch, that is archaeological anthropology, which has also contributed to understanding disasters. This approach emphasis on this approach emphasizes the role of disaster in socio-economic evolution of populations. Archaeological evidence are largely related with the material aspect of culture like habitat, art, use of terrain, etc. These evidence throw some light onto how people cope with disasters or what sustains a society's resilience to disaster and what sustains a society's resilience to disaster. Archaeology indicates that which segment of population re-emerged after the disaster and how and why some disappeared. Also, it indicates that what mixture of strategies a culture might have adopted to face disasters. Oliver Smith and Hoffman 1999. After having discussed the anthropological understanding of disaster, we will now move towards understanding the meaning of disaster management and then we will see that how anthropologists can contribute towards effective disaster management. Thank you very much.